Welcome to Norse Code, the number one podcast for your Minnesota Vikings. I'm your host and producer. My name is James Pagoshnik. Thank you guys so much for listening. And at the other end of the tin cannon string, we have our analyst and co-host. You know him from numerous blogs and podcasts around the internet, most notably from theathletic.com. He is Mr. Useful Human, Arif Hassan. Arif, how are you doing tonight?
I'm good, I guess. How are you?
I am doing fantastic now that I finally got through that intro. It only took me 3 times. Yay, off season. Go team. I remember a couple of weeks ago, a couple of months ago, somebody went, I realized from the clip show, you guys do the intro like live every time. Why would you do that? It's like, yeah.
Good question.
That's an excellent question and a thing I am definitely thinking about today. So welcome to this week's episode. We've got some stuff to go over. There was some mini camp stuff that's happened. Mike Hughes was traded. There's some news out of that. A lot of interesting conclusions that people are making as a result of the Hughes trade that we can discuss. Also, Tim Tebow and Kelvin Benjamin are now tight ends, and I can't stop laughing about it. And we have a fantastic mailbag. But before we start, just want to thank all of you for listening to Norse Code. We've got plenty of cool stuff planned for the rest of the year with COVID kind of, I want to say, like, kind of winding down, or at least
receding
as it were. Yeah. We have some opportunities to do some really cool stuff. So please keep listening, and we may have a show or two to announce. Also, if there is any potential interest in a live show in Baltimore, please let us know. We have some interesting ideas, but we want to make sure people would potentially show up to it. So if you would be interested in such a thing, please drop us a note either on Twitter or norsecodepodcast@gmail.com. Just want to put some feelers out there. Want to see if there's any interest in a potential show in for the Baltimore game. So also, before we start with everything, just want to thank everyone who took a moment to donate to the GoFundMe that I had mentioned last episode. It did really well after we had posted, and there were a few names that I recognized as like show regulars that had donated as well. It really did mean a lot to everyone involved. I had actually misspoken when I was speaking about the GoFundMe. My brain wasn't exactly right for a couple of days after that episode. It wasn't that he had 2 kids already. He had one that was on the way. That was like 27 weeks. So it was it was even worse than I had mentioned, just because my brain wasn't completely functioning as to like wrapping my head around what had happened. So again, thank you guys so much for donating to that. Really do appreciate it. I just kind of went off on a minute and a half thing there. So thank you so much for doing that. But we do have a couple people who have gone the extra mile for Norse Code, and we should talk about them here. We do have 2 new Patreon subscribers over at patreon.com/NorseCode. The first one is from a fellow who just lists his name as B, who has a personal connection to Arif, in a manner of speaking. He says, after 6 years of listening to you guys, it's time for me to pay up. At training camp in 2014 or 2015, I yelled, "You rock, Arif!" You waved. I was the dude in the Vikings jersey, if you're having trouble remembering.
Yeah, got it now.
You have no idea. You have no memory of this whatsoever.
What are you talking about? It's the dude in the Vikings jersey. Thanks, B.
Thanks, B. I'm thinking that was the dude in the Vikings jersey, if you're having trouble remembering. Keep up the good work, my dudes. Thank you, B, for joining us over on Patreon. Also have a quick mention of Don Biggs as well, as somebody who has joined us over at Patreon. That is over at patreon.com/NorseCode, and I've got news on that in just a second. Also, you can donate to the show at paypal.me/NorseCode as well. Or you can go over to our Threadless store and buy all of the baby onesies that you could possibly need for your Norse Code needs. So, once again, that is over at threadless.com. And just because we do this, or we did something like this last year, I wanted to do it again. We will be putting out the new Patreon episode on the regular feed next week. I'll be doing that just so you can get a taste of what we typically will put out for the episode. So if you're interested in this, you can take a listen to it and download it and go over to Patreon and pay for future episodes and check out all the back material that we have on it. So next week's episode, we will not be doing a new one. It will just be some banter and discussion stuff. So go ahead and take a listen. That'll be posted again next week. Okay, all of the shilling aside, all of the other stuff aside, I suppose, no, we're not doing Manscaped. That's right. I was going to mention we had a Manscaped email to us the other day about potentially about doing a potential ad read for them.
They said they were big fans of the show, and they just quoted the show description directly at us, so we know that they listened and are big fans.
Yep, and then asked for any information about the show we could potentially give them.
Yeah.
Not even
fans of the show.
Not even listens, just so what's the show about?
Huge fans.
Absolutely huge fans. So, no, we will not be doing a Manscaped read this week, but we do have some news.
You say this week like it's a threat. You better donate.
Patreon.com/Norse Code, or by God, we will manscape the hell out of you. Let's go over to the news and let's head over to the Mike Hughes trade. Often injured Mike Hughes was traded to Kansas City for a 6th-round pick in 2022. The Vikings also gave up a 7th-round pick in that year's draft as well. Hughes was the 30th pick overall in 2018. Hughes had been injured a number of times, and there was a lot of concern about his neck, correct?
Yeah, so he suffered a neck injury. I think that's his most recent injury. But yeah, I mean, he suffered a number of, he's had lower body and upper body injuries in his injury history. Actually, it might be more interesting if I just find an injury history, because these things exist online where they just log everybody's injury history overall. So,
I mean, if you want to be accurate for the sake of accuracy's sake, yes, you could potentially pull up an injury list for the gentleman that we're speaking of.
All right. So in 2018, of course, he had the ACL tear. That was, I think, 4 games into the season. Oh, no, he played 4 games, but he tore his left ACL in week 6, missed the rest of the season. Then he had a neck strain in early January. They call it a cervical neck strain on this site, but the description is he suffered a broken vertebra in his neck. So that's cool. And so that was in January. Obviously, that's the reason that he missed the Saints game, which is why, of course, Andrew Sandeo had to play in the slot, if I remember correctly. And then prior to the 2020 season, he missed 2 games due to a neck injury. And then again, later in the 2020 season, suffered another neck injury that placed him on injured reserve. And I believe this might be missing 1 injury as well. So he has quite a history of injury. The ACL injury used to be, an injury that you tended to be concerned about, but the neck injury is something that you're always going to be concerned about. And then there's also just the fact that while he was with the Vikings, aside from his rookie year in those 4 games, he largely underperformed. I think a lot of people remember the Dallas game where Michael Gallup put him in a blender, and Amari Cooper a little bit. It wasn't just Michael Gallup, but I think that was more concerning because if Amari Cooper beats, your second year or your third year cornerback, you can say, hey, maybe next time or whatever, Amari Cooper's really talented. But when it's Michael Gallup, who is a talented receiver, but can only really ever be receiver 2 and probably now receiver 3 in Dallas. But for most teams it would be a receiver 2. That's kind of your first round pick not doing well against him is a big problem. And that's not the only game that he's had issues with. He had, I think, an issue in the Green Bay game as well. And so if you took away, obviously, his biggest games, his numbers actually look really good, more than if you took away most cornerbacks' worst games. But you just can't count on that consistency. So I think Kansas City thought, hey, this is a former first-round pick. We might be able to find something. All it costs us is moving down from the 6th round into the 7th round. Obviously the pick didn't work out for the Vikings, which it's kind of weird because after he got that pick 6 as a rookie, Zimmer gloated about how useful that pick was. And then ever since then, it's been some sort of karmic retribution against Zimmer for bragging about how smart he is. Which I'm glad that that's not a universal thing. If I had karmic retribution dealt upon me for every time I talked about how smart I am, either directly or indirectly, I probably wouldn't have the show anymore.
No, you probably wouldn't have a lot of things, actually.
I don't think I'd have my job. I wouldn't have the show. I wouldn't have this house.
Yeah.
So I'm glad that that's not like universal and that karma's fake. So that's good. But yeah, that's it obviously didn't work out for the Vikings. That sucks. Hughes was always I wouldn't say he was like frustrating to cover, at least as a as a journalist. He did availability about as often as you'd hope a player does availability. His answers were pretty good, so he's never an obstacle to coverage, which I think in the modern NFL is actually pretty good relative to a lot of players. So it kind of sucks seeing him go, but it makes sense from the Vikings in terms of how much value were you going to get out of a guy that you didn't even offer a fifth round option for. But at the same time, the Vikings just don't really have cornerback depth. And it's not as if Hughes is like worse than, because they didn't draft a corner, right? I mean, the only guy that they drafted who could conceivably play corner, they're switching to safety. And so the Vikings, and we'll talk about this in a second, but the Vikings just signed, for example, Perry Nickerson, who's been cut from 3 other teams. It's unlikely that Perry Nickerson, possible, I'll eat my words, I'm sure, but it's unlikely that Perry Nickerson, for example, is a better player than Mike Hughes. And so you look at this roster, you see Patrick Peterson, who may not regain his 2018 form. It's been, 2 years since he's been, a pretty quality guy. You got Cameron Dancer, who gets injured he had 3 injuries last year, as a rookie, right? 3 injuries last year. Mackenzie Alexander, who was actually fairly healthy for the Vikings, but got hurt in week 17 in 2019, as well as which is another reason that Andrew Sendejo had to play that game as a slot corner, and then also got hurt in Cincinnati. I wouldn't classify him as a consistent injury concern, but Cameron Dancer is probably going to miss a couple of games. Mackenzie Alexander, you don't know, is reliable. Patrick Peterson may or may not even be a starting quality player at this point. Jeff Gladney may not play at all this year, given the serious allegations against him. And just generally speaking, the Vikings have always found a reason to dip into the cornerback depth. I mean, Dylan Mabin is still on the roster, and I would guess that Mike Hughes is a better player than Dylan Mabin, and Mabin saw playing time last year, right? Chris Jones, who's not on the roster, saw playing time last year. They dipped into their 5th, 6th corner. Your cornerback depth right now consists mostly of Chris Boyd. If we're saying that Gladney's not going to play, it's Patrick Peterson, Mackenzie Alexander, Cameron Dancer are your starters. And then when an injury happens, you're going all the way down to Chris Boyd. And then maybe Harrison Hand. Maybe they switch Cameron Bynum back to corner but that's you're switching a player out of the position that you think he could play. So that's the concern, is that the Vikings have already had concerns about cornerback, both long-term and short-term, entering the draft. They didn't add a cornerback in the draft. They didn't even add an undrafted free agent corner, and decided to trade a cornerback away. While one of their potential starters is in the middle of an offseason problem that could take him away from the Vikings for an entire year. And obviously if he did what he's accused of, should keep him away from the Vikings for an entire year. So I think a strange move from the Vikings maybe tells us just how far Hughes has fallen in the Vikings' estimation. But it could be a situation where the Vikings thought, well, it's not as if he's going to get a compensatory pick. We might as well get something for him now. And normally, I get frustrated when the Vikings don't use that logic. Normally, I think that the Vikings should do this much more often. I thought they should have traded Kyle Rudolph early instead of extending him, for example. I thought, with some of the receiver, depth that they've had over the years that I didn't think would project out. That's something that they should have done. They very often move very late on guys instead of early. This is the first time they move early on a guy, and I'm just like, I don't know if that was the move. That's kind of weird. So that's, I don't know that Mike Hughes would have changed anything for them dramatically, except in the worst case scenario. But that's the whole point, is that, depth players help you out and prevent the worst case scenario from materializing. If the Vikings are one game out of the playoffs and it's because they lost a last second touchdown because Dylan Mabin is covering, Marquez Valdez-Scantling or whatever, dang. Like it might have been better to have, Mike Hughes out there. So, an interesting move.
The initial reaction on Twitter seemed to be one of, well, this clearly means the Vikings know something about Jeff Gladney's legal situation, because otherwise they wouldn't,
They don't.
Well, that was the thing. Is my first thought was, or It has to do with Mike Hughes' neck being held together with like popsicle sticks and that like sticky glue, not the glue sticks, but like the white like sticky like.
Like the worst craft glue.
Yeah,
When,
exactly.
When you needed to use it in like first grade, you were like bummed out.
Exactly. Not a glue stick, the bad stuff. It was like it was that. It wasn't the situation of like of involving legal troubles. Like it didn't make any sense at that point. It seemed more like we aren't going to be keeping him anyway. And I think you and I had even spoken on the show at the end of the year, this last year, of like people that we expected to be around for next year, and Mike Hughes was not on that list.
Yeah, he was not, and I think that's fair, right? I think nobody expected Mike Hughes to return, especially because they didn't give him the 5th-year option, which that's not the end all be all. Right. The Bears didn't give Kyle Fuller a 5th-year option. They end up, re-signing him because, he did so well that year. And then also, he might not be worth $10 million or $12 million or whatever the 5th-year option for his draft slot is, which was 30th because the Vikings did well the prior year. But he could still be worth having on the roster at a reduced price. That typically doesn't happen, but, that could have been the possibility. But I think everyone just kind of agreed, he's probably not going to stick around.
Yeah, it didn't seem like it would be tied with Jeff Gladney's stuff at all, but I wanted to mention it because there were so many people that were just so very sure that this had something to do with the Jeff Gladney situation. Like, even if Jeff Gladney's legal stuff is cleared up, like that's not a guarantee that he would be starting next year either, because that just, for whatever reason, this situation just screams commissioner's like special exempt list.
Yeah, it really does. I would imagine that's kind of the direction you're headed in.
Yeah. Well, let's talk about a couple of people who've signed over the last couple of days. As you had mentioned, Perry Nickerson was signed, cornerback. Also, Amari Henderson was signed today, and these were all tryouts.
Well, Perry Nickerson wasn't, but Amari Henderson and Evan Kazarzik were tryouts. The reason that's important is because the Vikings seemingly signed more tryouts, I think, than any other team. I don't know that for sure. Certainly much more than average. A couple of years ago, I took a look at how many teams signed tryouts over the course of like a 3-year period, which is tough. Nobody keeps a database of this, so I had to like look it up for like 32 different teams. It sucked. At that time, a couple of years ago, the Vikings were far and away the most likely to sign someone from a rookie tryout into camp, right? And then when you take a look at how those tryouts do versus other undrafted free agent rookies, how likely they are to make a practice squad and how likely they are to make the roster outright, it is substantially higher. So at the time I looked at it, it was something like an 18% chance for a rookie tryout to end up making the roster over a 3-year period since they joined the team. And then obviously, because of that, a much higher chance, like a 40% chance of making the practice squad, which is huge, compared to like an undrafted free agent. Those odds are just much, much lower, much, much lower. And then since then, the Vikings have, since I did that, the Vikings signed CJ Ham. So at the time I was looking at data for Adam Thielen and Marcus Sherrills and like one other player that was a tryout that they had signed to the roster or to the practice squad. And then since then, they signed CJ Ham, who obviously, that year he was a practice squad guy, and then he ended up making the roster eventually. Another great example of a tryout guy making the roster is Chad Beebe. He was a 2018 tryout. He ended up making, I believe, the practice squad and then the roster. I don't believe, and I'd have to double check this, I don't believe any of the 2019 tryouts did. And then 2020 didn't have rookie tryouts because they wanted to limit the number of people coming into camp for COVID reasons. So this year they limited the number of tryouts that you could have to 5. So the Vikings typically bring in like a whole roster. Like there's like 40 people that are mostly tryouts plus like the 6 or 7 or 10 rookies that they have, plus the undrafted free agents. And then they typically cut 1 or 2 undrafted free agents and bring those tryout guys in. And those tryout guys, by virtue of having stood out in a field of 40, including some undrafted free agents that they had initially suspected were better players, those guys end up making the roster. So I always want to pay attention to these guys because I think that, in the long run, they're worth, they make the roster above the guys that are guaranteed $100,000, right? Above the $40,000 signing bonus guys, the top undrafted free agents in the market. they're more likely to make the roster than those guys, right? Like Chad Beebe beat out Corey Robertson, who is the top undrafted free agent in Vikings camp that year. Aside from I think like Jake Browning, which doesn't really count. He's a quarterback. So yeah, those are people to pay attention to. I don't know a ton, especially because Evan Kazarczyk, I think, he wasn't a rookie this year. I think he spent like a year in Buffalo. Yeah, I don't know for sure, but that was something that came up too. Is that the undrafted free agent pool is so limited, it's so low that they didn't bring college rookies in. So the Vikings signed a normal number of undrafted free agents, which was much more than like 90% of the NFL. I think the Patriots didn't sign any UDFAs. Washington only signed one. 4 other teams, including the Giants and the Falcons, signed only 3 undrafted free agents. There just weren't that many. And the Vikings roster is only at like 86 now, right? So out of the potential 90 that they could have. So that's something to keep in mind. So yeah, Amari Henderson spent time with the Jaguars last year. I think he spent time on the actual roster. No, he was on the practice squad, and has added some size since then. He was described largely as a zone corner by Dane Brugler in the 2020 draft guide that he put out, and didn't have a ton of play strength. So the fact that he's added a little bit of weight, that's probably good. As for Evan Kazarczyk, spent time it looks like he was. So he was at the University of Buffalo. Sorry, that's wrong. I wasn't at the Buffalo Bills, it was the University of Buffalo, and he spent time in training camp with the Falcons and did a tryout with the Packers. So yeah, he was a starter for the Buffalo Bulls, the University of Buffalo, for 3 years, and has good testing numbers. Not great, but like pretty good testing numbers. Generally mirrors pretty well, but has a narrow base, according to Brugler. So yeah, it was a bunch of 2020 rookies that they brought in. I think there's at least one more guy. The rookie is Kyle Hemby, safety from Southern Miss. And I believe Marquise Bridges was the second-year player, and then they brought in another guy. So yeah, I would pay attention to these tryouts. They're not traditional rookies by the standards that the Vikings typically bring into rookie minicamp, although sometimes they bring in second-year players. So yeah, that's what I have. I don't know a ton about these guys. I'll be watching a little bit in the lead up to camp because I want to make sure I've got a couple paragraphs on every single player heading into camp by the time by the time I write that camp guide. So, wait until then to get a more complete report.
There you go. Also, Kellen Mond was throwing at minicamp, and there's been enough discussion by people who absolutely hate Kirk Cousins on the gloriousness of Kellen Mond. How have his throws looked? And is there a reason for immediate hope for these misguided souls that believe Kirk Cousins is the cause of all the problems for the Vikings?
Well, I don't think there's any hope for those guys. As for Kellen Mond, I thought he looked really poor in rookie camp. I also kind of don't care, right? So there are a couple of problems with Mond that I identified in rookie camp, and mind you, they've had 3 days of rookie camp. I saw one. My eyes weren't always on Kellen Mond. I was watching Riley Patterson whiff some kicks. I watched Amir Smith-Marset do actually fairly well in some of the route running drills. I watched Wap Pylor. I feel like it's Pylor, but I saw him, make a couple of catches. I saw Blake Prohl drop a pass. So it wasn't always watching Kellen Mond. So take it with a grain of salt, and then take another several grains of salt in that it is rookie camp too. If I had watched every Kellen Mond pass and came away with this conclusion, you would still not want to take too much away from it. But it looked like he wasn't getting the ball out on time. It looked like he was kind of late on his throws. It looked like he was really weirdly mechanical in the way that he was throwing the ball in terms of his throwing motion. He wasn't necessarily making the right decision. He threw an incomplete that saw video. I think Will Raggett tweeted out a video of him throwing what should have been a pick. Yeah, I thought he looked bad. I don't like really care. He's learning the offense, and it seems like he's working a lot on his footwork based on the stuff he was saying. And so when you're doing that kind of stuff, when you're concentrating on what your feet are doing, you get kind of distracted in terms of what you're doing with your eyes, in terms of what you're reading, and you can only focus so much on so many different things. And it looks like he's attempting to kind of rework his motion as a player, which is just it's always going to make him look a little bit worse, and he's going to look a little bit late regardless. So I'm not concerned, but yeah, I mean, no, he wasn't great. I actually maybe would have been a bit more concerned if he was playing at full capacity, right? Because it would probably imply that he is not attempting to change anything about what he's doing. Which, I mean, you're a fourth round pick, right, or a third round pick, right? You weren't a first round pick, so what you were doing isn't going to get you there. I know Mike Zimmer said after he was asked, hey, Kellen Mond expressed like a lot of praise for Kirk Cousins and said he wanted to model his game after Cousins. And Zimmer was like, well, he should do his own thing, which was kind of weird. It's kind of funny, honestly.
Well,
but yeah, that's like very like, excuse me.
But, well, we drafted this guy because the other guy's rainbow is slowly going to be ending here. So,
he shouldn't 100% be doing his own thing because that's not get drafted for 2 whole rounds. So there's some stuff he should be working on. But he wasn't very good in camp. Whatever, who cares?
So another thing that I wanted to mention, just because it's kind of national news stuff, is Tim Tebow and Kelvin Benjamin are now tight ends. Which, I mean, Tebow's been out of the league for a long period of time, and Kelvin Benjamin has, I don't want to say eaten himself into this role, but there's been enough Kelvin Benjamin thick jokes for a long time.
Benjamin has not maintained the same body profile over the years. I'll say that. I think the move to tight end for Kelvin Benjamin does make a lot of sense. We'll see if he makes a team. A lot of people were enamored with his rookie year. I remember saying in his rookie year he wasn't very good. And he was like 1,000-yard receiver, right? And at the end of that year, I was like, I don't think he was that good. And whether or not I was right, like I have no idea if I was right because like he got injured for the 2015 season, and maybe he never recovered. Maybe he was good, and I just refused to see it. And then I was vindicated by circumstances that are outside of what I had determined, right? So, but he never really regained the form that he had his rookie year. Maybe it's injury related. Either way, I think this is a pretty good move for him. We'll see if he makes a roster, but I think it's a smart football decision by the Giants to see if they can get something out of him, especially again in a year where there's just fewer rookies that you can bring into camp just because the talent pool is just not there. There's still that talent pool has decided to return to college because they were granted another year of eligibility by the NCAA. So fine. The Tim Tebow stuff is like, it's a difficult one to kind of dissect because I am like pretty sympathetic to the people that are like upset. And I get it, right? Like he hasn't played football. I mean, he's played baseball much more recently, right? He played AAA or AA baseball much more recently, right? Never got a call up to the Mets. He's 33 years old. This is the first time he's made the position switch, although evidently not, because Greg McElroy said that they tried him at tight end with the Jets and he just wasn't good there. So, maybe he did play tight end a little bit in practice and they just never moved him there because he just wasn't very effective at that role. There's this narrative that Tebow refused to switch to tight end. And while I believed it, maybe he was game for it and it never materialized for him. Maybe the Patriots were like, well, it doesn't look like he could be our red zone quarterback. Maybe he could be tight end. And they just decided that based on what they saw, he couldn't. McElroy was also upset because they compared Tebow to Taysom Hill. And McElroy was like, Taysom Hill ran a 4.4. Like Tebow's a good running quarterback in college, but he ran a 4.8, right? Like Andrew Luck ran like a 4.56, right? Cam Newton ran a 4.55. Like those are athletic quarterbacks, right? And then you've got the super athletes, that like, it's probable that Lamar Jackson would have run a 4.3 had he run. But like to be like a good move quarterback, you shouldn't be running a 4.8. Like that's Jameis Winston stuff. So that's interesting, right? He's a good running quarterback because of various aspects about like the nature of running from the quarterback position, especially back in 2011 where it was just a little bit less common. Um, but that doesn't make him a good athlete at tight end, especially because he probably had to put on a little bit more in terms of size in order to be a tight end. But the thing that gets me is a it does make sense that players would be resentful of the situation, not mad at Tebow, because like if Urban Meyer calls you up and says, "Hey, we want you in our organization, we'll pay you to play football." I mean, why should he turn that down, right? Like, yeah, go for it, dude. But mad at Urban Meyer for giving this guy a chance when it seems like he'll be getting more opportunities than makes sense given his career accomplishments, or mad and resentful that like the fourth or fifth string tight end is going to get so much media coverage while and that's what McElroy was talking about, right? Not mad at Tebow, but mad at the amount of coverage that a fourth or fifth string tight end is going to get versus somebody that's got a much better chance to make the roster or is higher up on the depth chart, is showcasing more skill, etc. I get it. I think for most years, the argument that Tebow is crowding out another player at the position, like another tight end, I think most years that would make sense. This year, I'm kind of having trouble with it. Like, I want to kind of agree with the people that are like, this is, such an awful publicity stunt. You're crowding out like real opportunities for people that would have had a chance to make it. But like a lot of these rosters aren't at 90. Like, there's just not enough players right now that NFL teams are confident enough to make a roster to fill out camp. Like those roster positions that like the 86 to 90 for the Vikings, those roster positions are going to be filled out by like all the veterans that still haven't signed with the team yet, right? Because there's a lot of veterans that that have yet to sign with teams. Like I think Eric Fisher, for example, just signed with the team. I forget who, but like there's like a lot more into like if I just take a look at like a free agent list. I think what Football Rumors has one, right? Of like the top free agents available. Where they've got Sheldon Richardson, Steven Nelson, Mitchell Schwartz, which he may or may not retire, Brian Poole, Russell Okung, Melvin Ingram. If I scroll all the way down to find a tight end, maybe I'm not going to find one. Trey Burton at 30, is he still available? That's interesting. Trey Burton, Tyler Eifert. There's no way. Is he still available? I'm Googling Tyler Eifert right now. But those are the guys. Yeah, he's still available. He's still a free agent. Those are the guys that are going to fill out those spots. Michael Pruitt, Richard Rodgers. And as much as Urban Meyer loves Tim Tebow, I bet that, push comes to shove, he's much more likely to sign Richard Rodgers to the roster than Tim Tebow, right? So I don't think that there's like some undrafted rookie. Remember, at least one team didn't sign any undrafted rookies. One team only signed one. 4 teams signed like 3, and I might be missing a couple of teams that didn't sign any, right? Like, those players aren't there this year. If it was last year or next year, especially next year, then you're creating some problems in terms of your roster building strategy. But now, maybe not. I think that McElroy is probably correct that it's more likely to cause discord in the locker room than it is that his leadership is going to be so effective that it's going to be useful to have in a locker room. I think you're more likely, but I don't know that he's like really taking an opportunity away from somebody. Like these free agents are going to end up filling out, like Marshall Newhouse is going to be a third string tackle for somebody this year, probably. Right. I doubt that, these guys are so out of the league that Tim Tebow is taking a spot from them. I think that push comes to shove, someone like D.D. Westbrook is going to see a roster before Tim Tebow is. It's just we're probably waiting until after June 1st. So, yeah, kind of weird, kind of funny, honestly. I expect him not to make the roster. I think Kelvin Benjamin is more likely to make a roster. But I don't know. It's just like this oddity of the 2021 season that I don't think we'd see in another year. That said, like it's Urban Meyer. Who knows? Anything could happen.
Yeah. Also, Trey Burton is in fact available somewhere.
Sure.
Why not at that at that point? All dumb stuff aside, the Tebow experience is responsible for one of my favorite NFL playoff betting moments in my lifetime. So I can never be that mad at the guy because of what he did to the Steelers in that playoff game. Like immediately when that playoff game started, I put money on Denver to win. It's like
The 316 game? My
yep.
God.
It's like, oh, there's no way. This is going to be the dumbest thing you've ever seen. Immediately bet
odds
somebody
did
at the
you
bar. I just bet a buddy at the bar. It was like $50. $50. This ends
That's
and this
so
ends
funny.
quickly. And
That's
then
so funny.
that play happens, and it's just like it wasn't Minneapolis Miracle like running around freaking out, but I was the loudest guy in the bar.
That's so funny.
Like that was.
I remember walking away from the Denver game that the Vikings played.
Yep.
Just like angry. Was I with you or no?
No, you were not. We were not doing the show that, or I was.
Oh, yeah, that's 2011,
yeah.
right? Yeah. And I was just angry, and I was like arguing with like some other Vikings fans or whatever, and I was like, Tebow's not that good, and a Denver guy came up to me. I was like, well, if he's not so good, how do you do this? And I was like, well, the defense is stellar, right? Like you can't ignore that and the guy like acted like I had committed some sort of like logic ball seppuku, right? Like then he was like, gotcha, thank you. Finally, someone acknowledges the Denver defense. I was like, what? What are you talking about, man? There's all people like when people are upset about Tebow, they'll talk about that's a normal reaction. You're so weird. It's like one of those like forum posts, like it was all a social experiment and you fell for it. You admitted the Denver defense was good. Like yeah,
it was.
Okay.
Like especially with what they did to Ben Roethlisberger that game. It's like they just beat the hell out of him. It's okay. Well,
sure.
Yeah, he'll take all the credit. Definitely won't take all the blame for it until the next week. Well, let's head over to the mailbag. And we have a number of great questions. And we're going to start off with Raul, who asks two questions here. Number one, after reading the scouting reports on Mond, I have the impression he's more than like an athletic Teddy Bridgewater with similar flaws related to deep accuracy and turning down deep throws. Let's say by year 2 that Mond is a tick better than Teddy, maybe a top 20-ish quarterback. In that case, do you move on from Kirk?
It would be so funny if he was a top 20 quarterback. Like, that's already an edge case for a third rounder, because if you're likely to be any good, you're most likely to be drafted in the first round. Like, people will remember, your Russell Wilsons and your Dak Prescotts, and then they'll forget, like, Sean Mannion was like a third rounder, right? That's a good outcome for a third round quarterback, is Sean Mannion. It would be surprising if he was a top 20 quarterback. If he is a top 20 quarterback, I don't think it would make sense to move on from Kirk Cousins, right? So you're paying Kirk Cousins probably over market rate at like $40 million in 2022, right? And you're paying Mond third round money, right? Just cheap third round money. So there's like a $40 million difference, right? Essentially, maybe $39 million, $38 million difference between the two. Does that difference get you more wins when you can invest that $38 million elsewhere? Like maybe you could buy, a high-end defensive tackle or a high-end edge rusher coming off for free agency. Maybe you can get a really good center if Garrett Bradbury doesn't work out, or a really good, left guard if Ezra Cleveland doesn't work out, or whatever, right? You could sign 3, $13 million players essentially. Will that difference in wins make up for the difference between Kirk Cousins and Kellen Mond, a top 20 guy, or Kirk Cousins and a top 20 guy? And I think the answer is likely no. I don't think so. I don't think that you can just buy your way into having the 2017 defense again and hoping that Kellen Mond doesn't screw anything up. So, yeah, that's kind of where you're at. I don't think that would be the case. As for so we have a couple of questions about Kellen Mond. Obviously, I don't know why we wouldn't. One of them is like, what's a good comp for him? And I couldn't figure it out. I was trying to think about, players that are good comps, because he has a really good arm, right? Just in terms of pure arm strength, but he doesn't throw deep, and he's not very good at throwing deep. So he throws intermediate a lot. And he also doesn't throw, he had the lowest screen rate. He doesn't throw screen passes, which part of it's, the Jimbo Fisher offense, right? He is fine testing kind of the outside hashes on intermediate throws, but he throws intermediate deep the least of all, right? Outside deep the least of all. When he does throw deep, it's usually the middle of the field. And he's a really good athlete, except he's not very good at throwing on the run, but he is good at throwing off platform inside a messy pocket. So who does that remind me of? And I couldn't think of anybody. So I looked at a couple of comps. Dane Brugler brought up Colin Kaepernick, which I don't see, right? Matt Waldman brought up both Colin Kaepernick and Robert Griffin, which I don't see. And these are style comps, right? I think that both of them believe that as prospects, Colin Kaepernick and Robert Griffin were much better, right? Which is why they went in the first and second round, respectively. And Kellen Mond went in the third, right? And they rated him as a third or fourth round guy. So it's not as if, they're saying he's as good as Colin Kaepernick. But I don't see the style comparison. He ran a 4.57 at his pro day. Those are 4.4 guys, right? I was just talking about fast for a quarterback. Well, 4.57 is Cam Newton, Andrew Luck speed. That's great. That's really good. That's athletic stuff. That's like Carson Wentz, I think, ran like a 4.5 something, right? Like a 4.55. That's really athletic for a quarterback. But it's not like game-breaking athleticism like Robert Griffin, Lamar Jackson, Colin Kaepernick. Like, that's nuts, right, what they can do. And so I don't think that the way that defenses approach them would be the same as the way defenses approach Kellen Mond, which I think is a failure point for a comp, right? Like if defenses don't react to this quarterback the same way in similar manner as they would to the comp, then I don't think it's a very effective or useful comp. Now, mind you, both of them had really good arms. Kaepernick was a much better deep thrower, at least at his best. And Robert Griffin was a much faster decision maker at his best. So I don't really see it. Plus, both of them were better at throwing on the run than Mond. So I don't know that there is a good comp I can find. The Teddy Bridgewater comp is so appealing for a lot of reasons, right? Teddy Bridgewater threw intermediate more than any other quarterback, I believe, in one of his years, either 2015 or 2014, which means he didn't throw short or screens or deep relative to the rest of the NFL all that often. That sounds a lot like Mond. Didn't throw a ton of interceptions. Like Mond had one of the lowest turnover-worthy play rates by PFF in college football last year. But he also had one of the lowest big play rates, big throw rates by PFF in the NFL. So that sounds a lot like Teddy. And I totally get it. But Teddy had like an average arm, maybe an above average arm if his platform was working, right? But Mond has a really good arm and he's really good at throwing off platform. And Teddy wasn't, except he sometimes was pretty good rolling to his left or right. So on the run off platform, he was good. But off platform inside a muddy pocket, he was just kind of average, whereas Mond was really good at that. Teddy was much better at kind of navigating the pocket versus pressure, as opposed to Mond, who was good at throwing against pressure, which is a little bit different. There's some differences there. Plus, Mond has an issue with late throws and decision making, whereas Teddy wasn't really a bad decision maker. He did hold on to the ball a lot, but he was still an anticipatory thrower. And so there's just like a lot of differences there that don't make me love the comparison, especially because Teddy wasn't a tight window thrower and Mond was one of the most aggressive tight window quarterbacks in the FBS last year. So I don't love it, but I do get the comparison. And in terms of how fun is this offense going to be to watch, you might get something similar. So I get it. But I don't know that there's a ton of really good comps for this guy. So yeah. I get it. I wouldn't move on from him if he only ends up being a top 20-ish quarterback just for the contract value. And I don't know that there's a good comp out there for him.
His second question is, if the Vikings have drafted a more athletic Teddy, have the Bears drafted a more athletic Trubisky? If so, how good is Fields at throwing left?
Fields is a much better athlete than Trubisky, which I guess is incorporated into the question. But no, I thought Fields is a phenomenal prospect. I didn't think much of Trubisky as a prospect. He was rated in the consensus board, Trubisky, as like 23rd, and Deshaun Watson was 22nd, and Mahomes was like 37, right? So the NFL got that draft more right than the consensus board did with regards to quarterbacks. For non-quarterbacks, the consensus board, I think that year did a really good job versus the NFL. But for those three quarterbacks, which is a position that matters, the consensus board was fairly off. Afterwards, it seems like people believe that the online draft community thought that Trubisky was an awful prospect, and they didn't. They thought he was a first round prospect, and they collectively thought he was the second quarterback, right, ahead of Mahomes. So I don't know that you can throw too many stones, except of course the Bears traded up from like 3-2 for Trubisky, which I think nobody was a fan of, except for like your super process oriented. Hey, if he's your top quarterback, you gotta make sure you get your quarterback. So I don't have it. Like I think Eric Eager doesn't have a ton of problems with the process there. But yeah, I was not a huge fan of Trubisky. I thought, 1 year wonder. Ted Wynn liked his game, and so he did actually a good job of convincing me that he was at least a first round prospect. But I didn't really love his role. If you listen to my evaluation of Fields in the pre-draft episode, I think it was Don from Ohio was like, "Why isn't Fields QB1?" I mentioned that I thought that he would be QB1 in a lot of drafts. I thought he would be QB1 in most of the recent previous drafts, just not this one. I like Fields a lot as a prospect, and I think that he throws on time a little bit better. He still holds onto the ball a little bit, but I think he's got a significantly better arm than Trubisky. I think that both in terms of accuracy and in terms of strength. And I think that he's got a much better sense of how an offense is supposed to work. Plus, he's just a fantastic athlete. And there's some video was taken of him at rookie camp, and some people sent it to me because he was throwing to the left fairly accurately, which of course people sent it to me because why wouldn't they?
It's almost like it's your brand.
Yeah, almost. Yeah, it's almost like I tweeted myself into it. Seems like he's pretty good at throwing to his left.
Well, good. I'm glad for any receiver who lines up on that side now. You may actually get a look. Luke Braun says, "I've connected my entire personality to the future of Wop Filer. I'm just going to pronounce it like that. Making the team. Did I mess up? I might have messed up."
Yeah, it's failure. I just looked up the Nebraska pronunciation guide, which was provided to them by Indiana. But it was like they just put a pronunciation guide up, I guess, for commentators. So yeah, it's failure. You did. He's like what, 5'9"? He's like a 5'9", 5'10" rookie who doesn't run routes very well, and his hands are like whatever. My rule for small guys is you either have to be an incredible route runner or you have to be really fast and your hands can't stink. And the only guy that I've seen really succeed in the NFL, despite that, of course, is on the team Chad Beebe, which, like, of all the exceptions to this friggin' rule, it has to be the one that's actually on the team I cover. Kind of wild to me. But yeah, he's not insanely fast. He ran a 4.57. So I guess he ran the exact same as Kellen Mond, and he's not a very good route runner, and he drops the ball a lot. I can't, right? Like, I think, like, you take a look at the small guys drafted in the first 3 rounds, and the ones that don't work out, their scouting reports almost always say he's got kind of questionable hands, unless they're speed demons like Will Fuller. Like, Will Fuller had questionable hands, but he's a really good deep threat. So it's either that or you have to be just a remarkable route runner. And Fillier doesn't have any of that. So he was fun to watch in college. I can't imagine he succeeds in the NFL.
Kyle asks, based on the draft this year, are the Vikings ready to give up on all round 4 and later picks last year other than Harrison Hand?
No, I've got a piece coming out actually tomorrow. I've already submitted it, so I can actually even say that. Most of the time when I say that, the piece doesn't come out. But by the time most of you are listening to this, the piece is already out at The Athletic, talking about the way that the Vikings drafted this year. And I think it's likely that only 2 rookies contribute this year. And those would obviously be Christian Darrisaw and Wyatt Davis. It is possible, right, that one of those edge rushers contributes this year, but they got tons of developmental players that don't have a lot of experience at their position. Like Chaz Surratt plays 2 years at linebacker, was a quarterback before that. Janarius Robinson started playing football his sophomore year in high school, and initially started as a linebacker, didn't play defensive end until his junior year of high school, right? And then he was a 4-star recruit. The other one, Patrick Jones, didn't play until his freshman year of high school, right? And still looks like a guy that needs to add, some technical instincts, right? Zach Davidson was a punter He's a Division II punter. The Vikings drafted him to play tight end. Obviously, he played tight end. In 2019, he actually was an All-American tight end at the Division II level. But I mean, he was a backup all the way up until 2019, which, mind you, he was up against like the guy in front of him, whose name I forgot, but he was a borderline NFL talent. So at the Division II level, that guy's obviously going to be the starter. But still, he couldn't really see the field all that much at tight end until his final year, which was 2019. He was supposed to play the 2020 season to establish his NFL chops. That got canceled at the Division II level, so he couldn't do it. Obviously, he had a really remarkable pro day. So it's not, but he's a punter playing tight end. Right. So he doesn't have a ton of experience. So a lot of and Kellen Mond, he's not going to see the field for like 2 years. Right. So a lot of the guys that they got, they're just not going to play this year. So I think, in fact, especially Harrison Hand, who's playing a position they didn't even draft or get an undrafted free agent. I think that this is a sign of actually being all in on players like Harrison Hand. Like maybe someone like Josh Metellus, maybe he should be watching his back because they did get a safety, right, and Cameron Bynum. But, he's up against like Miles Dorn and Luther Kirk. Like he'll probably be fine. You take a look at like someone like Blake Brandell. They got a first-round tackle to start, but they didn't get a depth guy to really challenge him, right? Like the only other linemen that they got were Zach Bailey, who's a veteran minimum free agent guy, Mason Cole, who they got in a trade, who's an interior offensive lineman, and Wyatt Davis, who's an interior offensive lineman, and he'll probably start. So I don't think that like last year's 6th-round pick, Blake Brandell, is somebody that whose position has changed. I don't think he's a lock to make the roster or anything like that. I just think that his standing hasn't changed, right? Who are some other guys from that draft class? I guess Nate Stanley's on alert because they drafted Kellen Mond. I think that was kind of already a given. And maybe DJ Wanham is on alert, right? Because they drafted 2 edge rushers. But I think really he's just going to be in a competition for the starting role either way. But, James Lynch isn't on alert. The Vikings invested more draft capital in him than they did Jalen Twyman, right? Like James Lynch should be just more concerned that they decided to sign a guy who's not a very good pass rusher ahead of him, right? Like that's the bigger concern. But I don't think Jalen Twyman being on the roster is like a huge warning sign to Jalen Holmes. Like it could very well be the case that Holmes gets cut because Twyman makes the roster, but it's not as if the Vikings invested so much into Twyman that Holmes shouldn't be a favorite for a rotational role right now, right? Or James Lynch, sorry, that James Lynch shouldn't be a favorite for a rotational role, right? So yeah, I don't know that this draft class is really anything that puts the later round 2020 guys on any particular alert because these guys are all super developmental.
Alessandro asks, who's the currently projected bench player on the roster with the best chance to surprise us and establish himself as a potential starter going forward? Rookies aren't allowed.
This one was tough. I was taking a look at the bench players, and it's just like the Vikings have kind of established who all of their starters and role players are going to be. The only ones where they haven't are at the edge rusher position, right? Which if I can't pick a rookie, you could say DJ Wanham, right? He's a bench player. I think Stephen Weatherly might be the projected starter by most people. But Wanham could win that job, and he could end up being kind of the guy, maybe. But, I don't see, BC Johnson overtaking Chad Beebe. If he didn't last year, he's not going to. I don't see anyone on the offensive line. I don't see anyone in the tight end room, right? Because everyone's projecting Irv Smith to start. Everyone's projecting Tyler Conklin to be the second tight end. I don't think Brandon Dillon is really going to be meaningfully challenging that spot. So I don't see that happening. I don't see it happening at 3 technique. I think, the money that they gave Dalvin Tomlinson is a pretty good sign of that. So I was looking and, I don't see a cornerback. We just talked about that. I don't see a safety. I think Xavier Woods is going to start. So it must be at the third linebacker spot, and it's probably the guy that would surprise you is probably Cameron Smith, just because he's been removed from football for a year, and his rookie year he didn't see the field all that much because Ben Gideon was still the third guy. So the year that he had a huge opportunity to establish himself as the base sub package, right, which is kind of a funny way to put it, but as the third linebacker in that sub package, he couldn't because he needed heart surgery, which was caught in a COVID-19 test, right? So this is probably his year, and I think he's the most likely player to kind of surprise and grab a big role, especially if I can't pick rookies. So I guess that's the answer.
Next question is going to be from Jay, who asks, do you think Mike Zimmer is changing his philosophy of defense based on trends with offenses? The signing of Dalvin Tomlinson as a big three technique, and the drafting of a small linebacker, Chaz Surratt, just to point to it.
Yeah, I don't know, because like the Vikings have drafted small linebackers before, right? That's what Troy Dye is. Um, and they've signed those guys too, like the two XFL linebackers that they've signed, DeMarquise Gates and Greer Martini, are both kind of coverage guys more than they are, run stuffers. I guess Cameron Smith is a little bit bigger. I think he weighed 238 at his pro day, and he's 6'2", so he's not like tall, but he's kind of bigger. But you could say Kentrell Brothers and Ben Gideon are examples of bigger guys, but I think that they also concurrently get smaller guys too, right? So I don't think that there's enough data there for there to say there's a trend, right? So that could be it. As for following the trend of offenses, getting someone like Dalvin Tomlinson is kind of a follow-up on having Shamar Stephen on the roster as a starter for 2 years. So if it's a trend, it started a little bit ago versus it being kind of a new thing. And how is it kind of responding to offenses? Well, I guess teams have kind of found out that against these wide zone style offenses that like Matt LaFleur and Sean McVay and Kyle Shanahan run, that it's good to have kind of a run stuffer on the interior and have your pass rushers on the outside. I mean, that's how New England beat the Rams in the Super Bowl, is that they invested a lot in a player like Danny Shelton. The idea was for the Bucs to do that with Vita Vea. Obviously, he got injured last year, but they signed actually a pretty decent nose tackle to make up for it. But a lot of these defenses still have had pass rushers on the interior, right? Like the Rams had a bunch of run stuffers on their defense, but they also had Aaron Donald, right? Like you can get away with a lot in terms of pass rush if you've got Aaron Donald to make up for it. So the Vikings don't really have that. So I don't know that there is a ton in terms of what offenses are doing that establishes it. Now, when I criticize the Dalvin Tomlinson pick, I went over some of the stuff that a lot of the people in the kind of the Vikings blog universe and the podcast universe have talked about, which has come up a little bit. I think Crasher brought this up, Luke Braun brought this up, Nick Olson brought this up, that the Ram style defense of having kind of effective run blockers up top so that you can lighten the box and have a 6-man box because these guys are occupying multiple blockers. And so you could be sound against the run game and still have guys that can drop back into coverage. That is potentially kind of a modern defensive look. And it could be the case that that's where they got the idea. I don't know that this is a trend for a lot of defenses because I think we're still seeing defenses respond to box count with box count. And this is just kind of an anomaly that the Rams have done. Brandon Staley has moved on. He's a head coach now. I guess we'll see based off of how the Vikings handle box counts in the future, which we'll see in the preseason. And then it'll be kind of worth bringing up. But I'll just refer you to my piece on the signing of Dalvin Tomlinson to see kind of what the best case scenario is in terms of the way that the Vikings have approached this. Now, if you ask the Vikings, evidently they'll say, no, this is how we've always done it, which is a lie. I talked about that in our last episode.
Let's go to our next question, which is going to be from Dr. Aaron Matson, who asks, which position/position group is more important to improve from the dumpster fire to merely below average? Wide receiver 3 or interior offensive line?
The analytics brain in me wants to say wide receiver 3. The response, of course, is that you can choose whether or not you put your wide receiver 3 out there, right? Like if your tight end 2 is a better receiver, if your fullback is a better receiver than your wide receiver 3, then you can just put that out there and mitigate but you can't replace a bad interior. Like that's just who you have. You just have Dakota Dozier. You can't like run an offense that only has 4 offensive linemen and get around it somehow. So I am sympathetic to that, and like my gut instinct is to say to get to below average from dumpster fire at interior offensive line is very valuable, and so that's what I would choose. But I do want to say there's a lot of evidence to suggest that that's really not the case. Not that it's bad to have, a below average interior offensive lineman. The money move is to have a below average interior offensive lineman. Not bad enough to be catastrophic, but, bad enough that you don't have to pay them too much, right? That's the money move from an analytics perspective. So it's actually good to have a below average interior offensive lineman. But the wide receiver 3 just gets more yards than the tight end too. Just gets more yards than the good receiving fullback. Like you'd have to have an elite fullback like Kyle Juszczyk. In fact, only Kyle Juszczyk, I think, would be the guy that beats out a bad wide receiver 3. An average wide receiver 3 is still getting more receiving yards than that guy. But the difference is he affects offenses in different ways and maybe enables your wide receiver 1 or 2 or your tight end 1 to get more out of, the formations where he's on the field. So his downfield effects or ripple effects or whatever you want to call it, have a better impact. But just in terms of comparing a wide receiver 3, you might even get more out of the run game if you've got a below average wide receiver 3, because they're more tempted to put out a nickel receiver out there or a nickel corner out there, and then you can run into that lighter box. So I think it's still probably true to upgrade your trash wide receiver 3 to a below average wide receiver 3, even though there's more options to deal with that fact than there is with an interior offensive lineman. That's something that I feel like I can be convinced otherwise. It's just I haven't really seen great evidence for it. Plus, you can mitigate pressure by calling plays that allow your wide receiver 3 to be your hot read, which is going to be more effective for you than if your tight end 2 is your hot read. So there's that as well.
Let's go to Andrew, who asks, best free agency targets with the current cap space plus the June 1st space.
Yeah, so I just went over it a little bit by taking a look at that, like the trade rumors thing, that list of 50 top free agents. I'll link it in the show notes. Who knows if it's going to be up to date by the time it gets published, but it was updated as of May 15th. Like the 4 players that we checked, while I was like, wow, I can't believe they're available. It turns out they were available. I would imagine someone like a Steven Nelson or Brian Poole at cornerback, maybe Richard Sherman, although I kind of doubt it. Darqueze Dennard is still available. He knows the system. He played under Paul Gunther, who is right now a senior defensive assistant for the Vikings, but, with the Bengals. And they run a very similar match style system. So, he, I think, would be a good addition. These are mostly slot guys. But I still think that would be valuable, especially since Mackenzie Alexander is actually not that bad on the outside anyway. So he might be depth on the outside. But I think that these players are better to have on your roster than Dylan Mabin, and you might be able to get them for veteran minimum. So those are guys that I would pay attention to in terms of targeting. Malik Hooker is out there. He's gotten hurt recently, so that's somebody that you want to be a little bit careful of, but he's a safety that you can add to the room that I think would be a really great add. I think this offseason we were talking about offensive linemen. Now I don't know, you don't want to tackle, right? Because you've already got your starters. But, maybe you want some healthy competition at the guard spot. Maybe you could have Mason Cole and Ezra Cleveland and somebody like, well, maybe not Try Turner. Maybe somebody like, this group is tackle only. It seems like Jermaine Illuminor, who could play both tackle and guard. He played for New England. Maybe Joe Dahl, who's played, I believe, also for the Rams as well as Detroit. Maybe even Nick Easton, right, former Viking. Bring that in for a competition. That wouldn't be bad. Brett Jones, obviously, is still available. So those aren't bad. But yeah, I think your top targets are all going to be these cornerbacks. Maybe Melvin Ingram, right? If you don't really like how your edge rusher room is looking, which maybe not, but I just don't know, like when push comes to shove, when you're cutting down your roster and you've only got, room for 5 or 6 edge rushers, who are you cutting? Maybe Jalen Holmes. That makes a lot of sense, but it's like Daniil Hunter, Stephen Weatherly, Patrick Jones, Janarius Robinson. That's 4 that are almost certainly going to make the roster, right? Maybe not Stephen Weatherly, but that's 4. DJ Wanham is probably making the roster. That's 5. And so now you don't have room for Melvin Ingram, right? Is it Jalen Holmes and Kenny Willekes? They're out. Jordan Brailford's out. Yeah, maybe I'd rather have, old Melvin Ingram instead of, Stephen Weatherly, but it kind of, why did they sign him then if that was the calculation they were going to make? Maybe like, every day is a new day and you don't hold yourself to the sunk cost fallacy and you just sign Melvin Ingram and decide by the end of camp that he's better than Stephen Weatherly. And, oh no, you made a mistake. You've got to eat $1 million in dead cap. That's fine. But I suspect that he's just not really on their radar because of just the number of bodies that they've added to the position. But he's somebody I would consider just because I would like to have a little bit more in terms of establishment at the edge. Justin Houston's also a really good example. Maybe Olivier Vernon. Who knows what these guys will command in terms of money. Trent Murphy, not a bad one either.
Let's go to Bill Bodke, who asks, Seth Walder recently updated his list of analytics staffers for different NFL teams. I was surprised to see that most teams have less than 3 staffers. The Vikings have 4 staffers, and only the Jaguars and Ravens have 6 to 7 staffers. Now, nerds are dirt cheap, and I would think larger analytical staffs would generally yield competitive advantages in both drafting and game planning. So why do NFL teams need such small analytical staffs? Here's my thought on it is, and just because I was reading all about what the Colorado Rockies did with their analytics staff, it's like maybe the Vikings and maybe all these other teams have enough people to like wash all the jerseys and everything. Did you read at all what Denver?
No,
or
what?
So here's something that, and I learned about this from following Dusty on Twitter, and then I dug deeper onto it and discovered more. So the Colorado Rockies were hiring their analytics people to be the clubhouse attendants. Like they were literally doing the laundry when people would come in and go, "Hey, can I get the numbers on this, like on this field or on this team?" You know, I can't do that right now. I have clothes to wash. Like this is like, Google it right now. Like this is like the Colorado Rockies were having their analytics people do the laundry. Also, probably not related. The Colorado Rockies are an absolute garbage fire this year.
I can't believe. Well, we'll link that article in the show notes if you've got it. That's nuts to me.
Isn't that insane? Like that is just absolutely absurd. Yeah, this was news that had come out earlier this year. As for what happened, as for what they were doing last year, and this was something that was reported to, that was posted on The Athletic by Ken Rosenthal and Nick Grove, on the Rockies beat. Yeah, so this is a thing that the analytics people were doing, because you got to make up for people who were furloughed. So we're gonna have the geeks go and do the laundry, and maybe do some numbers if they're lucky.
So if you, I don't have many comments on that. So if you look at like who are the 2 most analytically driven teams in the NFL, and it's probably the Browns or the Ravens. They've got some of the biggest staffs on this list. But there's also, the Eagles are probably in that, maybe even in that first tier, but certainly in that second tier, and they've only got 4, right? The Vikings only have 4 on this list. And it's an interesting list because a lot of people have like issues with it. They think, this, that, or the other player, person, whatever qualifies. And, he's got some responses to some of them, like the Titans have someone in their front. So the Titans have no one on the list, right? They're just listed as NA. And the Titans, if you click on their front office link on their website, they've got somebody listed as a data analyst. But that guy is a marketing analyst, right? And so, these things can get kind of confusing. Maybe these sizes are like, the sizes of these departments are bigger or smaller. One thing I'll add, though, is that these are people whose primary job is listed within analytics or data, right? And there are people within those organizations that will perform the duties of somebody within an analytics department that maybe don't have that title or also have another title, right? So somebody in the front office whose primary job is to kind of be a liaison between the analytics staff and the scouting staff, may have a deeper background in analytics and may actually even perform some of that stuff without having that title. So, these are not the definitive be-all, end-all of that list. That's one point to make. Another point to make is that the Vikings have hired third-party data scientists and data analysts to supplement their analytics operations as well. So that's something to keep in mind too, is that sometimes the NFL teams will hire somebody to do a lot of the grunt work of what they want to do for 1 year, provide them with models that they can use and then run those models. Or like the Patriots will bring in different consultants every year and talk to them. Like they brought in like the author of the Thaler Massey paper on the draft analytics. They brought in people that do combine analytics and consulted them. And they are very open to these kinds of ideas. And you take a look at the Patriots, they've got one person listed, director of research. But The guy who's retiring this year, what's his name, Eddie, whatever. He was always pretty open to listening to data analysts and stuff like that. So that's another thing to keep in mind is that sometimes these lists are accurate, but don't tell you the story that needs to be told with regards to how some teams handle, a quantitative analyst, right? That's something to remember. There's also, something to kind of keep in mind is that the size of your analytics department, like you mentioned, right, may not matter, right? Like if you're hiring those guys to do laundry, who cares how big the group of people who's called the analytics department is? If they're not performing analytics their organization is acting on, then the effective size of your department is zero. The Jaguars have one of the largest, if not the largest, analytics department, and the son of the owner, Tony Khan, owns a data science company, an analytics company that's used by Major League Baseball teams and presumably within the Jaguars organization. They also drafted a running back in the first round, like multiple times, right? They drafted Leonard Fournette and Travis Etienne. And when they drafted Travis Etienne, they had like a offensive rookie of the year candidate on their roster coming off of his rookie year at running back that they didn't have to pay because he was an undrafted free agent, right? Like, it doesn't matter if you're not doing what your analytics department's asking you to do. Like the Texans have 3 members in the analytics department, just one fewer than the Vikings. Do you feel like they're an analytically run organization? I would argue no.
I mean, that department is probably like one of the saddest analytic department used to be. Anyway, one of the saddest analytics departments in the entire NFL. And like Bill O'Brien left, like, oh my God, we can breathe. we might actually be listened to now.
Maybe, Nick Caserio is comes from the Patriots, an analytically minded organization, which again only has one person listed on this list. And hey, they've got the same. So the Houston Texans have 3 people on their list. The LA Rams have 3 people on their list. And I know that they're an analytically inclined organization. First, I follow Sarah Bailey on Twitter, who does a lot of the data analysis for them. She's one of the 3 people listed here. But also, you asked Jordan Rodriguez, who covers the Rams for The Athletic, about how integrated the analytics operation is into their scouting, and it's deeply integrated. She actually did a really good story on Jordan Fuller, the safety I think that they drafted in the 5th round as a rookie that played a really big role in their defense this last year, despite the fact that they had 2 good safeties on the roster already. And it's very clear that they pay a lot of attention to the output of their analytics department. So I would imagine, given the number of decisions that need to be made within a football organization that are improved with an analytical look, you don't actually need a department that big, and your marginal gain on a much larger department is probably pretty small. That said, I agree that because nerds are probably dirt cheap, like a lot of people will take less money to work for an NFL team than they would in the financial sector or, working in advertising analytics for Google or whatever, not even the top guy, just like one of the guys there. A lot of people will take a lot less money working for a team because there's a lot of people's goal to work in sports analytics. Nerds are dirt cheap. And so you probably still are getting positive return on investment on your 4th or 5th guy or gal that would otherwise would not be contributing very much versus the 1st or 2nd person that you add. You're still probably getting a positive return on the investment if you're only paying them. I don't know what their salary is, but if it's $60,000, they probably make twice as much in another sector. So or a person who just won the big data bowl. A lot of those people, are college kids who happen to own their own analytics firm because they just incorporated them with the IRS and then used it to enter the big data bowl. Those guys are probably really cheap. So yeah, it's still probably better to keep hiring more of those guys. The Vikings promoted a scout, Scott Kuhn, to be the director of the analytics department. And either at some point in his career, he was cross-trained or he was initially trained in data analysis at some point, and then they decided to use that training, or he is continuously cross-trained as a scout into analytics. Either way, the Vikings have apparently worked from the football operations side and recruited their analytics staff from the football operations side, and then have brought in pure data scientists from the outside as consultants. So There's a lot here that, and I don't blame Seth, because Seth is using this as a kind of a rough guide, and he's very open to people kind of telling him, where he may have misstepped or not. But Seth is providing a broad picture, but, for the Rams and for the Vikings, I would say that, the way that their analytics department is run tells you something a little bit different than what just the number of people employed in that operation provides you. So, you've got some teams that are very analytically inclined, that have large analytic staffs, like the Browns and the Ravens, but you also have teams that have large staffs that are not analytically inclined, like the Jaguars, right? You've got teams that are very analytically inclined that have small staffs, like the Rams and the Eagles, and to some degree, I think the Vikings, right? But some of these staffs are not very analytically inclined, that do have small teams. So yeah, the correlation is there, but I would argue it's pretty loose.
So probably doesn't have to do with the whole, washing the clothing of the players.
It's unlikely that these teams are having their analytics staff washing the laundry.
I mean,
I don't know what the Jaguars are doing with the 5th, 6th, 7th person in the analytics department.
I was going to say the Texans, that might have been their job.
The Texans might, actually.
Yeah, the Texans. I sent you the link, by the way, and I sent you the information. This is just an absolutely wild story that Dusty and I have been making fun of for a while, and I just now had a reason to bring it up on the show.
That's incredible.
Yeah, of all dumb things, you've got your analytics department doing the laundry, going, well, I'd love to give you the stats on that pitcher, but I got this whole stack of jerseys to clean, so I guess we'll get to it when we get to it. MJ asks, where does the kicking competition rank for each of you in the off-season storylines? Kicking is something near and dear to the Norse code heart.
Yeah, no, it's got to be up there. So I would say that because of the relationship that Vikings kickers have to the Norse code, unbeknownst to them, to the Norse code podcast, it has to be a little bit up there. But the relationship is perverse, right? Because for the purposes of the podcast, it's a little bit better if the worst one wins the competition, right? Imagine how much fun we'd have if Kari Vedvik had actually earned a job.
Oh God, we'd be printing T-shirts with just all sorts of stuff on it involving the kickers. We would be inspired. It would be poetry,
right? It'd be amazing, right? God, I'm reading this story now. Shining shoes, cleaning laundry, buying chewing tobacco for players.
I know. How is this a thing?
Wait, for the visiting teams too. Wow.
If you ever wanted to really upset Arif, don't tweet at him and try to get into a fight. No. Find something that fun. Directly affects his people. His analytics people. This is it. This is gold.
When was this reported? Oh
March.
My God. March. Wow. There
you go.
What? Okay, no, I got to move on. Let's talk about football. What? Chewing tobacco for the visiting team. So the kicking competition, obviously, it's our highlight story. We just never lead with it because we wouldn't want to, give the goods away right away at the beginning of the podcast and have people turn it off.
Nope, that's absolutely middle of the show material right there.
Yeah. For sure.
Absolutely. Andrew Frazier for a Reeves Kickers Corner. Why don't
with you guys?
The kickers are important. Why don't teams invest more in kickers? Kickers score so many points and often are the reason teams win or lose games. Yet GMs are lambasted for drafting kickers. I am confused.
Well, Andrew, I understand your confusion, but there's two reasons here. One is that the marginal difference between the best kicker, it's probably Justin Tucker, and the 20th best kicker, I don't know, Chase McLaughlin, former Viking Chase McLaughlin, is actually pretty small. In fact, the best kicker is pretty good. Maybe the second best kicker and the 20th best kicker is actually really small. The kickers score the most points for a team, but that's true for nearly every team. And so if you get to choose between the guy who's going to score the most points for your team and the guy who, if you replaced him, would also score the most points for your team, then it doesn't matter, right? So scarcity is the thing that matters. It's replacement value that matters, not raw scoring power, right? And so, that's the reason that quote unquote running backs don't matter. It's not that they don't have an outsized effect on the total yardage that you're going to get. A running back gets 100 yards a game. That's 1/3 to 1/4 the number of total offensive yards you're going to create. That's a lot for one player. But if you replace that running back with another player, the argument goes from the analytics people is that for the most part, they're going to get the same number of yards, and that your offensive line is defining more of that than your running back is. In fact, an individual offensive lineman is going to do more in terms of your running game than a running back is. That's the argument, right? The same is kind of true with kicker, especially because there's a high degree of volatility between a kicker. So if your kicker is going through a bad season, just briefly imagine that strange scenario, Vikings fans, the weird, chance that your kicker's having a bad season. More often than not, there's a reason that your team didn't know this was going to happen, because it's a high volatility position, and kickers will just miss kicks sometimes. They just miss kicks, right? Like Justin Tucker didn't miss an extra point for years, like for his entire career, right? Even after they moved it. And then missed the last 2 years, something like that. And the first time he missed an extra point, like his eyes bugged out. It's an amazing gif. Like he existentially was like, what is happening? Right. Even Justin Tucker missed an extra point, and then the next year he missed another extra point, right? These things just kind of happen. It's a high volatility position. If you've got a veteran kicker that has been, an 86% kicker, or has been, depth adjusted kicking, a top 10 kicker, and then kicks 63% or whatever the next year, the odds are he's probably going to return to 86%. But, you don't know that that's the case for a rookie, right? If he kicks 63% his rookie year, well, you have no idea if he's truly an 86% kicker, or, hey, this is who he is. But you're probably going to move on because, using some Bayesian reasoning, which is not probably how an NFL team thinks of it, but is the reasoning generally that they'll use. The odds are probably that they're a worse kicker, given that the only information you have is that they kicked poorly. So that's one reason, is that the replacement value is actually fairly minimal. The second reason is that undrafted kickers perform better than drafted kickers. And I remember bringing this up somewhere and then looking for the research for this. So from a raw numbers perspective, that's true. That's not difficult to find out. The best kickers in the NFL primarily have been undrafted, and they perform better than drafted kickers. That's true. But it could just be the case that there are more undrafted kickers, right? There's so overwhelmingly more undrafted kickers that from a rate perspective, that drafted kickers do outperform them. And I remember looking this up a number of years ago, 3-4 years ago, and finding out that even if you account for the number of undrafted kickers that are signed into camp every year, right, and you count everybody who doesn't make a team as an undrafted kicker as a failure, and then also count the undrafted kickers who make teams and then are cut within 2 years as failures, that even then, that those kickers outperform drafted kickers, right? I thought I found that to be the case. I cannot find that research currently, so I can't say that with a lot of confidence. But it seemed to be the case that even undrafted kickers outperform drafted kickers. So teams are just not good at identifying who a good kicker is, right? Obviously, a good example is Roberto Aguayo, right? Drafted in the second round. Now, one could make the argument, right, that Roberto Aguayo was wigged out by the fact that he was drafted and that so much pressure was put onto him as a second round kicker that he absolutely had to make it, and then it broke him, right? Well, at the time, a lot of people, Gordon McGuinness of Pro Football Focus, and a couple of other people that I actually pay attention to with regards to their ability to evaluate college kickers, that actually care about college kickers, thought that Roberto Aguayo wasn't even the best kicker in college that year. It was a guy that wasn't even draft eligible or hadn't declared for the draft. It was Zane Gonzalez, who kicked for Arizona State University. Remarkable kicker, right? His freshman year connected on 25 of 30 field goal attempts, made every extra point, which, in college, a short extra point, right? Sophomore year made nearly every extra point, connected on 22 of 27 of his field goal kicks. right? And the difference here for him is that Aguayo didn't actually kick that many from beyond 40 plus, and that should have been a red flag for NFL teams. But Gonzalez, he was asked to kick a lot from 40 plus. In his final year, despite the fact that he kicked a ton from 40 plus, including a game-winning 50-yarder, went 92% on his field goals his final year, right? A lot of people back in his junior year thought he was a better prospect because of his ability to kick 40 plus than a Roberto Aguirre, who I believe was perfect his final year. Well, Aguirre was drafted the next year in the 7th round by the Cleveland Browns, gets cut within 2 years. The Cardinals pick him up. They cut him this last year. Like, a drafted kicker, had all of the, people before he was even draft eligible, people thought he was a much better kicking prospect than the guy who got drafted in the 2nd round. Multiple people. And he still didn't do it. He still didn't make it, right? It's so tough to evaluate kickers. So NFL teams' certainty in their ability to evaluate a kicker is sky high. It is way too high. A lot of these drafted guys, some of these guys that third parties will say is the best kicker, right? Like who is the top kicker in this draft? I think the guy that got drafted, Evan McPherson, was the consensus number 2. The consensus number 1 didn't get drafted, something like that. Jose Borregales, who I believe is an undrafted free agent. Whatever, right? Who knows how these guys are going to turn out? I don't know. You probably have to be a good kicker in college to be a good kicker in the NFL. But if you're the top kicker in college, that doesn't mean you'll be an average kicker in the NFL. It is so weird how this turns out. So that's the other reason. The first is that actually the difference between the top kicker and the second kicker and the third kicker in a particular college class, tough to tell, right? But it's the marginal value between the top kicker, the second kicker, and the 20th kicker is very small. But also, you can't even figure out who the top kickers are. Justin Tucker wasn't drafted, right? And he signed on to a team that actually had a pretty good kicker in Billy Cundiff. I don't know, man. It's just tough to find kickers.
Just the way that works. Andrew Shad asks, looking back on the past few drafts, which Vikings players have been closest to their expected draft value?
So I was just looking up Justin Tucker's field goal percentage in college because, that's what I'm doing. He was an 81% kicker in his final year of college. That doesn't scream must get guy. All right, so guys who met their draft value. This one was pretty hard. I did a little bit of pre-show research to figure out kind of who met their draft value. And so for this one, I'm looking for people who kind of nailed their draft value. So Stephon Diggs obviously overperformed, so he doesn't count. Eric Kendricks, 2nd-round pick, overperformed. He's an all-pro level player. He doesn't count. Daniil Hunter, same thing. Dalvin Cook's an interesting one. If running backs were truly replaceable, then I would say, maybe. But I feel like Dalvin Cook has consistently put his name in the hat as one of the top 3-4 running backs in the NFL. That, I think, outperforms a 2nd-round pick. If you knew you were getting a top 4 running back in the NFL, most teams, not me, but most teams will draft that guy in the 1st round. If you guaranteed he was going to be a top 4 running back for the next 5 years in the NFL, most teams would draft that guy pretty high. So I would say he outperformed, for whatever reason, his value. The next guy on the list in terms of career approximate value generated, which is not a really great way to evaluate it because offensive linemen are overvalued because they get a lot of points for just starting. But Pat Elflein, 3rd-round pick, I would say he maybe underperformed, but a lot of people would say that was a bad pick. Might be overestimating the kind of contributions you tend to get from a 3rd-round pick. I would say it is probable he underperformed. So I wouldn't pick him. Brian O'Neill has overperformed. Trey Waynes has underperformed despite the fact that he finished his Vikings career as a pretty high-level cornerback. For the most part, he didn't perform like an 11th overall pick. Garrett Bradbury underperformed. The next guy, offensive lineman, just gets points because he started. TJ Clemmings, even for a 4th-round pick, he underperformed. Ben Gedeon, I think, is a good example of a guy who met 4th-round value, was on the path to exceed 4th-round value, and then unfortunately due to injury probably was never going to do it. So in terms of his career, probably performed his 4th-round slot. Jaleel Johnson, I would say, probably slightly underperformed his. I don't think if he had started consistently, he'd overperform. So as a rotational guy, you kind of expect that out of a 4th-round guy. And I would say he's underperformed as a rotational guy. Mackenzie Alexander is another interesting one. I think he's probably pretty close to nailing that. in terms of hitting second round draft value. Slot guy doesn't see a ton of snaps, but has played a ton of games and has played them pretty well for the Vikings. That sounds like a second round guy to me. The next two guys on the list clearly overperformed the draft slots to Stephen Weatherly and Ifeadi Odenigbo. Alexander Madison, I would say, underperformed just because he's not seeing playing time for obvious reasons. Daniel Carlson underperformed. Irv Smith, we'll see. I think he's on the path to kind of hitting his second round value and maybe even above that. And then after that, it's kind of hard, right? Olabisi Johnson, I think, is overperforming, but over the course of his career, might hit kind of league averages. Tyler Conklin right now is performing how you expect a fifth round pick, but is on the path to overperform. For the most part, these averages are determined by the average of a bunch of players that have underperformed and a couple of people who have overperformed. And it's difficult to find the guys that really exactly hit second round or third round or fourth round value. But you get kind of close with a player like Ben Gettien or Mackenzie Alexander, and maybe with somebody like Irv Smith. Elijah Lee, I think, is a good example of a seventh round pick that is hitting or that has hit their seventh round value. Kind of made the team, stuck around the NFL for 3 years, never a huge contributor, played on special teams a lot. That's maybe a good example.
Next question is from Arif's Neglected Resistance Bands and says, love your work as always. You are truly the real most valuable podcast. Still wondering about that audio glitch after my tweets are read. Don't feel obligated to fix it immediately. Just thought you'd like an update. Next question is from Ian Pauley, who asks, since the topic popped up on my timeline, favorite and or oddest Metrodome experience you ever had?
You've probably got a better story than me. But my first game watching the Vikings, I think, it might have been the Bills game. That can't be it. Maybe it was the Bills game where Tavares Jackson took over for Brett Favre and then on a handoff immediately injured Adrian Peterson. You remember that, right? Like
I do. Yeah. Yes, I do remember. Just like you had one job,
right? Like
hand off to Adrian. Don't injure him.
And there you go. All right, knee to the hamstring. Good job, dude. One of the few people who's ever hurt Adrian Peterson happens to be his teammate. Like him and Deshaun Gomez from like the Washington football team. Like, yeah. Come on, man.
That's pretty good.
So there's that, but not only that, we bought tickets from whatever was popular at the time. Maybe it was still StubHub. But it might have been Ticketmaster, right? Anyway, at the time, it wasn't normal for these online companies to tell you the quality of the seat that you were buying. So you just kind of had to infer from the price. But I was in college. I couldn't take the $20 upgrade to get a better seat. So we just bought, me and like 3 or 4 debaters bought like 4, not the 4 cheapest tickets, but 4 of the cheapest tickets we could get. So we were all the way up in the rafters, and it turned out we were seated right behind a pole. Like you just couldn't see the game. And I don't think like people understand how stadium design was for a long time. There were just seats that they would sell where you could not see the field. That was just normal, right? Like when the new Yankee Stadium was built, it got a lot of criticism for poor sight lines. And if you saw the pictures of the sight lines from some of those seats, they were objectively bad, right? Like it wasn't good, but they were miles better than the sight lines for stadiums built in the 80s. Like for some of those seats, like it's no longer normal to like sell seats for new stadiums, for stadiums built in the 90s and beyond. It's no longer normal to just have seats behind pillars and columns and like platforms. Like the issue with the Yankee Stadium was that there were just these platforms for suites that you just couldn't see like beyond the third baseline or whatever. It was just awful, right? And so they actually had to install TVs on those platforms so that people watching the game, as they moved their head, could move their head towards the television to see what was happening in the game that they were attending.
Yeah, there's a number of old baseball stadiums specifically like that. Like even Fenway is misery, and you have to.
Yeah, I can imagine, right? Because they haven't, those old, they're too historic to replace.
You can't actually tear that place down and put a new one up, despite the fact that the seats are made for 19th century, 20th century people. Like it's
Right.
not made for anybody that's human now.
Yeah, but like football fans don't really have to deal with that anymore because like the only old stadiums, like what Green Bay, you don't have to worry about sightlines in Green Bay. There's nothing. There's no. It's an open air stadium, so there's no pillars, right? I mean, they're all awful seats, right? Because they're bleachers, but you don't have to worry about sightlines. And so the old stadiums in the NFL, I don't know how bad Soldier Field is because the only times I've been there, I've been in the press box. But it's an open air stadium, so you don't really have to worry about it. But all these new stadiums do a really good job of, obviously taking taxpayer money. Except I guess the LA one, I think that one's completely privately funded, and obviously the Dallas one is. But they do a really good job of making sure almost all the seats have good sight lines. That was not the case for the Metrodome. Like, bought those tickets and sat behind a pillar. We just had to at one point we just it must have been in the second quarter. How they always advertise that these games are always sold out, and they were in the middle of their sellout streak. There were always empty seats further up, and so we just after 10 minutes in the first quarter, we just stole some seats.
Yeah. That was the smart move. Yeah, when I was going right after I graduated from college in 2008, 2009, I practically lived in the second floor, or the second floor, and then the corners, because you could still see and it was still good as long as you were not behind a pole. That was the caveat. You had to not be behind the pole and you'd be fine. I attended game 163, which I thought was really awesome. In Twins lore, that game actually means something. And then the Twins immediately lost out of the playoffs, and that was kind of the end of that. But it was a real nice moment to attend.
Even I know about game 163, and I don't even know what a baseball is.
Exactly. Weirdest stuff in the Metrodome. I was there for the San Francisco game where the San Francisco 49ers got 5 timeouts in a quarter.
Yeah. Oh my God.
That was replacement refs.
Yeah, that was funny. And that was the worst day for replacement refs, aside from that wasn't the same day as the Fail Mary.
No, Fail Mary was the Monday night. Yeah. It might have been the same weekend.
It was the same weekend, yeah. But yeah, it was the worst day for the refs until the very next day.
Yeah.
Because not only they did the 5 timeouts, but that was an afternoon game. So it wasn't a noon game, right? It was the 4:30 game or whatever, I think.
Yeah, it was. Yeah, because we had stopped at Matt's bar beforehand. Yeah, that would have to be it. Yeah.
Yeah, and that was people were talking about that. And then it was the Ravens game. Might have been a Ravens Steelers game, but it was the Ravens game. And that was the game where they had made so many bad calls, and I fully agree with the people who call them bad calls. They had made so many bad calls that the audience, the crowd was overwhelming the stadium mics when they were yelling, they were chanting bullshit. That's that game. It was the same day as the game that different replacement refs gave the 49ers 5 timeouts and a half.
Yeah, 49ers still lost. But it was great. You got 5 timeouts in the second half, and you still lost. It was amazing.
And then the bullshit chants, and then Monday night the Fail Mary, which broke the lockout.
Yeah, as it turned out, that was the league's limit. That's what they were willing to deal with.
Amazing.
Jeez. Yeah, I was at that one. And like anybody else who has left the Metrodome, I have been thrown out of the building, not by a human being, but by the air suction of that room.
Oh yeah. Oh my gosh.
Have lost a hat. I did lose a hat once in that. Picked up a different person's hat. So
I was warned about it 10 seconds before I entered. That was my first warning that by the way, there's going to be 30-mile-per-hour winds when you try to enter.
Yeah, by the way, you're going to enter into a talkie era movie scene where you're just going to be walking against the wind.
And that was my sophomore year of college. I was still a waif. I was 140 pounds. I could have blown away, dude.
You could have blown all the way past Sheiks. It would have been amazing. Down forth, yeah. Also, a buddy of mine and I are planning on a smoking day on Saturday, looking for good ideas that are mostly simple, no longer than 8 hours usually. Wings tend to be my staple, but I'm open to suggestions. We will not be using pellets. I appreciate the dig at dawn, especially this week.
Yeah. I think that you should give a shot at making your own bacon. There's so many great bacon tutorials on YouTube of smoking your own bacon, and every single person I've seen that has, first of all, been honest about whether or not a high effort project, which these aren't high effort, they're just a lot of time, but whether like long time projects or high effort projects are really worth it. Like people who will just tell you, you know what, don't make your own puff pastry, it's not worth it. Like those people. Um, will tell you that making your own bacon is worth it. So I would say smoking pork belly and making your own bacon is worth it. And I would do it multiple ways. So make traditional bacon. It's going to be incredible. But also try and follow like a Korean or Japanese marinade slash smoke recipe, because you can make some amazing pork belly buns. So if I'm limited to one recommendation, it's going to be pork belly. But if it's two recommendations, I mean, I don't see how you don't at least attempt, ribs.
Ribs are definitely something that you could do. It's not going to reach 8 hours. If you are smoking ribs and you hit 8 hours, I don't know what the hell you're doing. Like you're definitely not doing it at 275. You're probably just drying out your meat at that point.
Yeah.
Otherwise, if I'm going to piggyback off of you for just a moment, you can do things like candy bacon and turn them into like burnt end sort of things.
Yeah.
That's really delicious. I have done that. All you need is just a nice slab of uncut bacon, which you can get from your butcher. Otherwise, chicken thighs are incredibly forgiving and always
so
juicy.
Resilient.
Yeah,
they're so resilient. Yeah.
I am also the type of crazy person who smokes steaks for a little bit of time and then sears them really good afterwards. So also a possibility.
That's interesting. Yeah, I like that.
I actually did a whole ton of those. My brother just likes to bring by a bunch of meat from the butcher and says, "Hey, you feel like smoking this?" I go, "Yeah, sure." So this weekend I literally had like 6 steaks on the grill, just going on Saturday, just sipping a beer. Saturday at like, noonish or something. And then when I was done with that, just put on the kids' stuff and whatever and called it good. And had a nice T-bone for myself. But yeah, it was just smoking a couple of steaks and then searing them afterwards. And the texture is right, especially after the sear. And, you cook it up to a certain point, and usually it's somewhere between medium and medium rare, and it calls it good. So,
also topically, smoking fish. Really good. It's just you're talking about a whole smoking day, and the fish typically, unless you're trying to preserve it, fish typically just does not take that long to smoke. And very often, I'll just grill fish over wood instead of like actually like smoking it. So
yeah, it's fun to put a little bit of smoke on it, but if you put too much, it really does absorb the flavors and the smell too much. Mm-hmm. If you wanted to make the most of that period of time, you could just get a smaller pork butt or pork shoulder and have a little bit of fun with that. But
yeah,
that would be my suggestion. Nick Howard asks, I purchased my wife an Instapot for her anniversary. My question is there anything I should know about it or any cool recipes? We actually covered this in, I believe, episode 258. And if I'm wrong about that, I'm wrong. But I believe it was 258 that we covered that. So if you want to take a listen to that.
Congratulations, by the way.
And yeah, congratulations. We have a series of questions that are all related. So let's... and oddly enough, while we were recording, Kellen Mond asked the question to Twitter, where should I go to do this? So
actually, I think Janarius Robinson did.
Well, both did, actually.
Oh, my God. Okay, sure, dude.
So the following questions have been asked. Draw Play Dave, please rank fish restaurants in Minneapolis for Kellen Mond. Alex asks, what will be the cause of Kellen Mond's trade request, freezing Minnesota winters or questionable Minnesota seafood? Joey asks, is walleye sushi a thing? And Nolan Kaler asks, where should Kellen Mond go for his seafood fix in the Twin Cities? Today, Kellen Mond went to Oceanair.
Oh, he went to Oceanair.
He did go to Oceanair today.
Did he have a review?
I don't know that he had a review, but he did post a picture of it on Instagram.
All right.
So there is that. But I'll answer the sushi thing here in a second. But we do have a few recommendations for seafood in the cities.
Oh my God. Yeah, he did tweet it. That's interesting. Oh, and Master Tesfatsion even responded. Um, okay, so for my money, I would say the best like kind of bang for buck in terms of like quality seafood versus the amount of money that you put in is Anchor fish and chips, but that's fish and chips, right? That's like fried seafood. So it's not really what a lot of people are looking for when they say seafood. And then the second best place that is more close to a seafood place, unfortunately burned down. The Tin Fish over by the lake. Honestly, it was incredible, and I hope that there's some way to kind of revive it. And what's really great is that despite the fact that it was a super casual place that didn't cost that much, they really took their responsibility seriously. Like they would tell you the where every fish was fished, how sustainable it was on like this rating scale, what you can expect from certain regions, from certain types of fish, and how that might change by region. And they would, and I think at the time you might even sometimes you could choose how your fish was prepared, and they would give you recommendations based on the fish that you got. So it was really incredible, and it just didn't cost that much, and it was super casual, and I loved it. I ate there a bunch of times. It's really unfortunate that it burned down, but that was one of my favorite places. A lot of people will recommend Stella's, was it Fish Bar and Cafe or something like that? And it's fine. I would say that from like a dollar per value estimate, it's not actually that great. So if you want good food and you don't really care how much it costs, Stella's is a pretty good option because it's unlikely that things are going to fail. Like they're not going to screw it up. They're going to provide some high quality food. I just always found it a little bit more expensive than it needed to be compared to other seafood places. There's a couple of really good oyster bars. So if you count that as like seafood, what's that one in Uptown? Like the Lowry is in Uptown, right? That's pretty good. There's one in St. Paul, the Meritage. That I've been there. That's really good. Master Tesfatsion responded to the Kellen Mond tweet with Masu in Northeast. That's a sushi bar. And for sushi, that's actually a really good sushi place. I really like that. And there's a couple of really good sushi places in the Twin Cities. I don't know if Sakura's is still around. That was one of my favorites.
That was easily one of my favorites when I was living down there.
Yeah, it looks like Sakura Restaurant and Bar in St. Paul is still there. So that.
Oh, good. That was the one that I was going to. Yeah,
because I went to. I think there was one in downtown Minneapolis at one point. I don't know, and that's the one I went to. But if this is the same company, and it looks like it is, the one in St. Paul, I would highly recommend that. Incredible sushi place. So yeah, other people recommended Ocean Air, and I guess that's where Kellen Mond went. I've never been there. Smack Shack is a more casual place that people love. I haven't been there, so I should check that out. And it seemingly doesn't cost that much. But yeah, I mean, from the places I've been to, Anchor Fish and Chips is really good. The Meritage is great. The Lowry's really good. Masu is great in Northeast. Shout out Master. It was a good recommendation. Sakura is really good. More expensive than Masu. But yeah, those are my recommendations.
So I've had Max before. And because I used to live just on the edge of St. Paul and Roseville, and so you would see Max going over to the bar that we used to frequent. I think that's still out on Larpenteur, between Larpenteur and Snelling and Larpenteur and Hamlin, I want to say. Max is good, but it's fried. It kind of scratches your itch as far as like fish and chips goes. Also, somehow, JJ Fish and Chicken out on University in St. Paul survived the riots. Never ate there myself, but apparently it survived. So
some people recommended it. So I guess is it locally owned? I don't know. It's a fast food type place though. So that's mostly what it is. So
it's historic in the sense that it has survived this long somehow. In a neighborhood that has had a lot of upheaval over the past 10 years. So kudos to them for surviving.
Yeah, kudos. I guess it's not local. It's owned in Illinois, but it's small for a fast food chain.
Yeah. Panhandle Slim asks, how much of a donation would it take to get a smoker cook-off between James and Don from Ohio? You know, I've made a lot of travel plans to Ohio over the last couple of years, and Don keeps ducking me. So you're going to have to ask him about it because he's not going to be there when I'm going to be there later this year. So I don't know. Eddie Crane asks 2 questions. First, who is Arif targeting in dynasty drafts this year?
Well, Justin Fields, but I'm in a 2-quarterback league, so it kind of matters more. Otherwise, let's see, who was I highlighting on my? It's boring to say someone like Najee Harris or Jamar Chase. So if I look down the list, if I'm looking at like 20th to 29th, 30th in ADP rankings, I guess. My favorites from that group are probably Kenneth Gainwell, Philadelphia running back, super crowded running back room. They've already got Miles Sanders. They've already got Boston Scott. So he's getting pushed down, but I think that, he's just a talented enough running back that when the contracts run out, I think that he'll be able to earn a spot as a high contributor. Amari Rodgers for Green Bay. There just isn't a ton of competition for wide receiver 2. We'll see whether or not Aaron Rodgers plays. I think that's kind of not as important to his value as a rookie. I think that he's a good enough player on his own that he'll be a wide receiver 2 and starting. And I think that if you're looking at like the 12th or 13th wide receiver off the board, that's not bad value. Tylan Wallace, I really like just as a player. Like, I know that Rashad Bateman's already there in Baltimore, and I know they don't throw the ball a lot, but I think Tylan Wallace is kind of worth targeting. And Pat Freiermuth, who's mostly a blocking tight end from Penn State, but there's nothing in front of him in Pittsburgh, and I don't think that there will be, and I think that they'll continue to use him. So those are guys I like. From a profile perspective, I do like Nico Collins. He's a wide receiver from Michigan. Reminds me a lot of Donovan Peoples-Jones in that he's a bigger guy with great testing that didn't do well in college, but has a great profile and could be. But I don't want to get a Houston receiver, especially a guy that I don't expect to get a lot of playing time. Chuba Hubbard is another guy whose profile is really appealing, but he's running back 2 in Carolina. Don't love that unless you anticipate that Christian McCaffrey is going to get hurt, in which case maybe. So there's guys whose profiles I like. Elijah Mitchell, same thing, but I just don't like their situations, right? Like Elijah Mitchell is behind rookie Trey Sermon and the whole running back group that they have. So I would kind of avoid it for much later in the draft. I guess I like Anthony Schwartz from Cleveland. Genuine Olympic track speed. He's like earned second place in the Pan Am Games or something similar, as well as was on the gold medal 4x100 team for that competition. So genuine speed. I think he also has just a fair amount of receiving talent. He's somebody I like, and his situation is not too bad. I wouldn't be shocked if they moved on from Odell Beckham or Jarvis Landry in Cleveland before too long. So that's not too bad. If you've got a really comfortable situation on a dynasty team, I think a late round shot at Kyle Trask isn't bad. I kind of like him as one of those quarterback prospects. And then even later in the draft, maybe Tommy Tremble, I think, is not a bad pick. A Carolina tight end. I don't think that much of Ian Thomas, in part because I had him on my team for so long and he's just never done anything for me. So, I guess super late, maybe Chris Evans, Cincinnati. I don't think that running back situation is going to be ever very good for him. And they got Puka Williams as well. But I think that, that's somebody, maybe Josh Imatorbhebhe from Jacksonville, pretty great jump ball receiver. And then Jamie Newman, Philadelphia, like super late, like 4th, 5th round of your dynasty leagues. The Philadelphia quarterback situation is chaotic. So, maybe take a dart shot there. But yeah, and, I just gave away my dynasty and I'm still in the middle of a dynasty draft. So we'll see how many people were listening to that.
Also, for Arif's beekeeping corner. While Arif failed to actually give me a recommendation for a bee race in response to my last question, I decided on my own to go with a breed called Minnesota Hygienic. It is an Italian variety bred specifically to better resist mite infestation. The installation went well, and as far as I can tell, the hive is starting strong, with the queen laying a consistent brood pattern. However, I've noticed that the hive appears to be unusually aggressive for the time of year that they're supposed to be more docile. Unlike their next-door Italian neighbors, the Minnesota Hygienics swarm my veil defensively upon opening the cover, and are clearly trying to sting through my gloves. This would not be abnormal during the fall season when they have a big honey reserve to protect, but summer is just barely around the corner. Any escalation of this behavior going into the honey harvest in the late summer could be problematic. What would a reef's advice be for pacifying my extraterritorial bees?
So, as a beekeeping expert, I've got a couple of thoughts, but the first is that I clearly gave you enough information on selecting breed of bees. Let's go with that. And you very clearly used some of that information going forward to kind of isolate which bees. So you're welcome for that.
Yeah, you can thank a reef for not having a bee race war.
Yes. I have a lot of thoughts on this, but I think that this handy numbered list that I happened to find online in my beekeeping forum travels that I commonly and often do can isolate some of them. Now, some of the things on the list I am a little bit concerned about. The first item on the list is genetics. That feels weird to talk about. Some prime sentences. If you notice that your colony is steadily getting more aggressive than when you first got them, regardless of the season, then aggression could be running through their bee blood. Oh boy.
We're not getting any better here, are we?
Yeah. But there's some other things on here that are interesting. Now, I assume that as a beekeeper, you're acting appropriately. So I don't think it's clumsy beekeeping, which is on the list. I don't think it's the lack of a smoker or using one incorrectly, which is also on the list. But if you're not using a smoker, maybe consider using one because it disrupts the alarm pheromone, right? So, too much smoke or too little smoke can cause them to get agitated. That's something worth watching some YouTube apiary videos on. But the thing that stuck with me on the list is maybe there's just not, as many flowers around or the right types of flowers around for them to feel as if they've got food security when they're making honey. So that could be part of it, is that they tend to become more aggressive when there's not enough food around. Now, I don't think, so some of the other items on the list, you probably would have already been aware of. If there is bee robbery, something that Italian bees are known for, evidently, according to the internet and not me. But that would be a different Italian or other type of bee hive. So that's probably not it, because it doesn't seem like other hives are interfering with your hive. You would already know if it was bad weather, which is on the list, but that's something to keep in mind. Something else that's kind of worth keeping in place, hive placement is on this list. And sometimes they say that sometimes beekeepers place hives in locations that are more convenient for the beekeeper than for the bees. And so place with a lot of human traffic or animal traffic will keep the bees in a constant state of alert. So that's something to keep in mind, is that you want to put them in a place where there's just not a lot of interaction with people. And hey, maybe the bee suit that you're wearing, has a smell that's, being activated. Maybe the laundry that you're washing the bee suit in, is scented in some way that raises their, alarm bells. Maybe this is a previously worn bee suit and it was worn with different bees. And so there might be alarm pheromones from a different beehive on it, or maybe whatever it is that happened the first time that raised the alarm for them, maybe that pheromone is stuck around for them. And so it might be worth, washing it or something along those lines with an unscented laundry detergent. So that's something to keep in mind. I will link this article, whose conclusions I don't fully endorse, in the show notes, because, as we know, the apiary corner is a big part of this podcast.
It is a cornerstone of the mailbag, and I enjoy any chance that we get to go to a reef's beekeeping corner. Let's go to James's anger corner for a moment. Ricardo asks an important question. In listening to the podcast over the course of the past few months, I have begun to notice a troubling trend. Between his hostility towards bingo people his general hatred of cats combined with other random dislikes, such as Firefly, I have become concerned that James has some sort of anger issue or issues. So my concerns have led me to a couple of questions. First, does James have any other hidden hatreds which have not made it to air? Boy, this is just going to go well, isn't it?
Boy.
Has he ever had a Christian Bale-style meltdown due to an audio issue or failed barbecue recipe?
I'll say this. I am confident he's had, but I've never heard it.
There are things that I've kind of like forget to clip out every once in a while. It hasn't happened in a while, but sometimes little things have been, missed. I have never missed a clip that can easily go into the Christmas show where I get angry. So no, that is not the case. Do I have any hidden hatreds? I have my biggest pet peeve, but if I told you, then I would see it on Twitter and everywhere else every second. So
he has disclosed it to me. He did not ask me to keep it secret, but as a good friend,
you know what,
which I am known to be.
I appreciate that. And the moment you sell me out, I swear.
Good friendship, but also here's a threat.
The moment you sell me out, I will end you. Somehow, some way, I will end you. Or a failed barbecue recipe. I got really upset when I messed up ribs last year, and I had talked about that on the show at some point.
You did.
But you endeavor to persevere and you fix it. Second, do you think his issues stem from frustration over his people's long history of mistreatment? Oh, this will be good. While I understand it must be frustrating to constantly be blamed every time livestock or a farmer's daughter goes missing, I'm not sure it justifies the level of vitriol he has for seniors enjoying a game of leisure or domesticated felines.
Good question, James. Is there some sort of historical inequity you're attempting to correct here?
No, I am not trying. Wow. No, I am absolutely not trying to do any of the sort. I hope my questions can lead to an open and honest exploration of emotional trauma and can help James move past whatever pitchfork-wielding / lamp-providing incidents may have led him to his current state. I
don't know what this business about the lamp is, but
we should talk
there
about
any
that
business
too.
About lamps? It certainly would not be anger-related.
No, that's kind of the opposite, really. Truly.
Yeah, one could say that, but it's a thin line.
Jeez. Just as a side note, I didn't mention at the opening, but I do want to mention it now that I received a gift in the mail this week.
Oh my God!
At a time when I was
from a Hall of Fame candidate,
Hall of Fame candidate, and I was expecting something else in the mail, which I also got, but I was expecting in the mail to receive this year's I do the Christmas swag every year, and I went out and thank God for eBay transactions with no reserve listed. Because I got something fantastic for dirt cheap, and I can't wait to disappoint somebody with it who's a Patreon subscriber come the fall. But I was expecting that, and instead what I got was a Viking lamp that is sitting here on my desk. I don't have a light in it yet, but I did receive a lamp, and I was like, I don't know what this is about. Is there some sort of a story involving a lamp that I don't know about? This is weird.
Yeah, very weird to give James a lamp. Everybody who's ever done that is weird.
I'm actually not disagreeing with that. Let's go to Don from Ohio, who asks, will the Norse Code Patreon money be used for James's bail bond after he gets arrested in Ohio asking for a concerned citizen? That's just mean.
We had a discussion about whether or not the Patreon funds could be used for bail bond. I did not know that this was a question, by the way. We had a separate conversation completely unrelated to this question. I did not know this was a question.
True story.
Today, right before we recorded the show, about whether or not Patreon money could be used for the bail bond. And I don't think we actually came to a conclusion.
No, we did not.
Whatever gets you to donate more is the answer.
There we go. Yeah, again, Don keeps ducking me. I'm going to be in Cleveland for the 2 Nine Inch Nails shows in September. And it just so happens to be the weekend that he's going to be in Hawaii getting married. So,
of course he chose the weekend. You're like that. He clearly chose it to avoid you.
This is the thing.
Cannot believe that.
And I reached out to him when I went to Detroit after we did the New York thing. Reached out to him. Hey, I know you're close to where I'm going to be at. If you want, come out. We'll talk for a little bit. Didn't make an effort. Ducked me. Completely ducked me. So yeah, I'm not. I'm starting to think Don's just afraid. Okay. No big deal. Before we wrap up, we didn't mention the schedule release because it's the schedule release. Is there anything in particular on the schedule release that is kind of like, say, like analysis worthy, but it's a series of games and we don't know who's going to end up being decent. What is there a game that's on the schedule this year that really stands out as like the most important game of the season?
I would say probably the game that might best determine whether or not the Vikings are ready to compete, should they be a team that we don't know yet. Like, let's say through 8 games, right? Let's say through half the season, the Vikings are like a 6-2 team, but they're unimpressive, or they're a 4-4 team and they're really impressive, and they lost for like whatever reason. They seem kind of small, or they got screwed or something like that. So we don't know if they're a good enough team to be a playoff contender, not just make the playoffs, but contend in the playoffs. The game that'll tell us the most about that is probably Week 9 against the Baltimore Ravens. And I wrote about this in my Athletic article, and I mentioned the Baltimore Ravens so many times as a dangerous team that the people that voted on them game by game or week by week, there was like the worst non-Baltimore game on the schedule in terms of Vikings fans voting about whether or not the Vikings would win was about 20%. And that was on the road against Chicago. So it doesn't even count. People just think that game is cursed, right? But it was like 30% of Vikings fans think they'll win this game. It was like the worst, except for Baltimore. It was like 3% of Vikings fans thought they were going to win that game. And the reasoning, of course, is that Baltimore was, I think, 3rd in points scored or points scored per drive. They were also 3rd defensively in points scored or points scored per drive. I mean, they were just a very complete team last year, and I don't think that they've changed substantially enough. I mean, obviously, they're losing Orlando Brown. We'll see what happens there, but they didn't actually even have Ronnie Stanley for most of the season anyway, and he's coming back. So they're so good offensively and defensively last year. That'll probably tell us the most. But I think the most important game will probably be one of the division games, as you'd expect. And that'll probably define whether or not the Vikings end up making it. But the one that tells us the most is probably the Ravens game. And I will say I would have liked to have played Chicago earlier in the schedule. I think that Justin Fields week 15 and week 18 is going to be better than Justin Fields week 2, week 4. So that would have been nice. And then it just would have been nice to play the Packers earlier, because whatever issues with Aaron Rodgers are more likely to be resolved later than they are to be earlier, just by the nature of reality and the linear nature of time. So it would have been nice to play the Packers earlier. So that's what I have to say about the schedule. The Seahawks are playing the Vikings, of course. So that's going to come up, as it always does, for me in particular.
Yep. That's just kind of the way it always goes. All right. Well, that has been another episode of Norse Code. Arif, where can they read your work?
So you can find me at The Athletic, theathletic.com/author/Arif-Hassan. Note, so the $1 a month promotion that was run like right before the draft or whenever, or maybe it was during free agency. So I thought that was the only time they were going to run that promotion all year. So when that promotion ended, that was kind of it. They've revived the promotion, except instead of $1 a month for 12 months, I think it's $1 a month for 6 months. But you can sign up at The Athletic, and I get credit every time you click on one of my stories and sign up for one of those stories. So I would extra appreciate it if you did that. But signing up for The Athletic is good, kind of regardless of how you do it. But you go to theathletic.com, you click through one of my articles or any other article, or just to the sign up page, and there is a promotional feature to get $1 a month. And I don't know how long it'll last. And I'm not saying this as a means of like, yeah, supplies are limited, who knows when this will end, kind of marketing gimmick. I'm just a bad employee. I don't know how long this will last. So maybe I could probably take a look in the Slack. Let me check real quick. This is great.
Support Arif, the bad employee, at his job.
Well, I mean, whatever helps me keep my job, right? Like, if I'm a bad employee, you might as well make me unfireable. let's see, where's the, I closed the Slack channel. Let's see. It's only for new subscribers, and they expect it to run for, I guess I'm not allowed to say when it actually ends, but for most of the rest of the month is what I'll say. So it's not going to be around for a super long time. But it's around again. So if you missed it back in March for whatever reason, but you can do it now. Now is a great time to do it. $1 a month for 6 months.
All right, that is going to be it for this episode of Norse Code. Hope you guys have enjoyed it. You will be getting a Patreon episode next week, just as a sample of what the Patreon people normally get, in case you are interested in such silliness. And then we will be moving on with another episode of Norse Code. So, for Arif, my name is James. Thank you guys so much for listening. And please remember to punch reality right in the face. And we will be back soon. Norse Code is the largest and only division of Norse Code LLC. You can find Norse Code on the Daily Norseman, SB Nation's official Vikings blog, at dailynorseman.com. You can also find it on iTunes, Spotify, YouTube, Stitcher, or wherever fine podcasts are aggregated. Our Vikings blogger extraordinaire and generally useful human is Arif Hassan, and he can be found on Twitter at Arif Hassan NFL. You can also find his written work at theathletic.com. I am your podcast host and producer, and my name is James Pagashnik. You can find me at the show's official Twitter feed at NorseCodeDN or my personal account at Big Mono. If you'd like to donate a few bucks to the show, you can make your one-time donation at paypal.me/NorseCode, or you can make a recurring monthly contribution by visiting patreon.com/NorseCode. A donation of $3.50 per month does get you bonus material from the show and much more. Any questions or comments that won't fit in a tweet can be sent to norsecodepodcast@gmail.com. On behalf of the Norse Code staff, we thank you so much for listening.
Our formula is this. We go out, we hit people in the mouth.